Lies you were taught about American history. Do you think the stuff we learned in school about American history was the whole truth? Well, it wasn't. And in this video, we're going to talk about some of those lies. Columbus discovered America. If you grew up in the US, you probably got the tidy version of the story. Columbus was this fearless Italian explorer who set sail in 1492, bumped into America, and boom, the New World was born. The way textbooks tell it, he was practically the opening credits to American history. Brave, bold, a little lost maybe, but definitely the guy who found America. Except he didn't. Not even close. When Columbus made landfall, millions of people were already living across the continents. We're talking thriving cities, farming, trade routes, all the stuff that makes up a civilization. To say he discovered America is like walking into someone else's house, sitting on the couch and yelling, "Guys, look what I found!" And here's the kicker. Columbus never even set foot on what would become the United States. His trips stuck mostly to the Caribbean, places like Hispaniola, Cuba, and the Bahamas. At the time, he thought he was near Asia, calling the islands the Indies. Imagine sailing through turquoise Caribbean waters, palm trees on the horizon, and yet telling yourself you had reached the edge of China. He went to his grave still believing that. Even if we're talking about Europeans, Columbus wasn't first. The Vikings, led by Leif Erikson, reached North America around 500 years earlier. They built settlements in present-day Newfoundland, hung out for a while, and then left. Columbus gets the credit because his voyage kicked off non-stop waves of colonization, spreading new settlers and armies across the land. Diseases like smallpox, which wasn't native to the Americas and arrived with European explorers, and conquest that toppled native nations, changes that reshaped the Americas forever. So why was this lie taught? After the US became a nation, leaders wanted a neat origin story. Columbus got turned into a ready-made hero, especially for immigrant groups like Italians, who claimed him as their own. Monuments, parades, and even a holiday locked him into legend. The tragic reality for native people, like violence, slavery, and epidemics, got pushed to the background in favor of a feel-good fairy tale. Coming up is Thanksgiving, the holiday you know for turkey and stuffing, but the real story is a lot messier than the classroom version. Thanksgiving was a peaceful feast. You know the Thanksgiving story where Pilgrims and Native Americans sat down in 1621, passed the mashed potatoes, and shared turkey in a warm, fuzzy moment of friendship? But that's the classroom version, the one kids act out with paper hats and feathers. The real event was more complicated. In 1620, a group of English settlers we now call the Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic Ocean on a ship called the Mayflower. They landed in a place they named Plymouth in today's Massachusetts. Life was extremely hard for them. They were not used to the land. Many people died that first winter, and they did not know how to grow food there. Nearby lived the Wampanoag people, who had been in that region for thousands of years. Their leader was Chief Massasoit. The Wampanoag had already suffered heavy losses from European diseases, so Massasoit was trying to protect his people from rival tribes. He saw that the new settlers might be weak, but could also become useful allies. The famous Feast of 1621 brought together about 52 pilgrims and around 90 members of the Wampanoag Nation. The Pilgrims were celebrating their first decent harvest in the new land and fired off their guns in excitement. The sound worried the Wampanoag, who thought it could mean a fight was breaking out, so they came prepared to defend themselves. Instead of clashing, the two groups ended up eating together. The meal was less about friendship and more about survival and politics. The Pilgrims depended on native knowledge of farming and hunting to get by, while the Wampanoag hoped the newcomers might help them against rival tribes. The food was what the land offered at the time: venison from deer, corn, and fish. Turkey might have been there too, but it certainly was not the star of the table. For a short while, this fragile partnership held, but within one generation, the trust broke down. The Pilgrims and their descendants kept pushing for more land, which brought tension and violence. This eventually exploded into a brutal conflict. So why do we still hear the cheerful version? In the 1800s, especially after the Civil War, Americans wanted a holiday that made the country feel united. Thanksgiving became that story, turning a tense and temporary truce into a tale of peace and gratitude. For many Native people today, the holiday is less about turkey and family and more about remembering loss, survival, and resilience. Next, we'll shift from holiday legends to the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. Most of you know the story where young George Washington chops down his father's favorite cherry tree, then admits to it with the famous line, "I cannot tell a lie." Instead of scolding him, his father praises his honesty. Well, that story is a lie, even though it became one of the most famous childhood tales in American history. But here is the truth: none of it ever happened. There is no evidence that Washington ever chopped down a cherry tree, confessed to it, or even owned a little hatchet. The tale first appeared years after Washington's death, in an 1806 biography written by Mason Locke Weems, a preacher and bookseller who wanted to sell more copies of his book. He thought a moral story about honesty would make Washington's character look larger than life, so he simply invented one. Historians quickly figured out the story was fake, yet the cherry tree myth stuck because it was simple, inspiring, and easy to teach children. Even Abraham Lincoln remembered reading it as a kid. The reason this myth survived so long is because it gave the new United States a hero who seemed perfect, almost saint-like. For a country trying to build pride and unity, that was exactly the kind of legend they wanted. The truth is that Washington was a complex man with flaws like anyone else, but the cherry tree story carved him into a symbol of honesty that Americans still repeat today. But this is not the only lie about the mighty George. Next comes the myth about his wooden teeth. George Washington had wooden teeth. The image is so common you can probably picture it right now. Washington, stiff in his portraits, secretly hiding a mouthful of wooden dentures. Kids are taught this in school, cartoons joke about it, and it is one of those facts that feels too weird not to be true. Except it is not. Washington never had wooden teeth. He struggled with awful dental problems all his life, losing nearly all of his real teeth. By the time he became president, he was wearing dentures made from a mix of strange materials: human teeth, cow and horse teeth, ivory, and metal parts held together with springs. Over time, the ivory dentures became stained from food and wine, and to people who saw them, they may have looked wooden. That is probably where the myth began. He hated the way his false teeth felt and looked, which is why he rarely smiled in portraits. Several sets of his dentures survive today in museums, and none of them contain wood. What they do show is how painful and embarrassing dental care was in the 1700s, even for the most powerful man in America. So why did the wooden teeth story stick around? It was simple, easy to picture, and worked as a fun little humanizing fact about a famous leader. Teachers and textbooks kept repeating it, and soon it was locked in as common knowledge. In reality, Washington's teeth were proof that even the first president had his struggles, though wooden dentures were not one of them. Now let's move from Washington's legends to another giant of American history, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves out of moral conviction. The way many of us are taught, Abraham Lincoln was a noble man who freed the slaves because he believed deep in his heart that slavery was wrong. It sounds simple and heroic, like the perfect act of a perfect leader. But the real story is more complicated. Lincoln personally disliked slavery and often spoke against it. But when he became president, his main goal was not to end slavery. It was to keep the United States together. He worried that if he pushed too hard against slavery, the border states that still allowed it but had not left the Union might join the Confederacy. That could have split the country even further. The famous Emancipation Proclamation came in 1863, 2 years into the Civil War. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate states were free. But it did not apply to the border states or areas already under Union control. Lincoln issued it mostly as a wartime strategy. By freeing enslaved people in the South, he weakened the Confederacy's economy and allowed black men to join the Union Army. This gave the North a big advantage. This does not mean Lincoln had no moral feelings. Over time, his views did grow, and by the end of the war, he supported the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery across the whole country. But his choices were guided as much by politics and military needs as by personal beliefs. So why does the myth of the great emancipator persist? Because people wanted a clear hero again. After the war, telling the story of Lincoln as the man who bravely ended slavery helped the country heal and gave Americans someone to look up to. The truth is more complex. Lincoln was a leader balancing survival of the nation with the fight against slavery, and only gradually did those two paths come together. And that takes us right into the bigger picture of the Civil War itself, and the lie many still believe. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. One of the most stubborn myths in American history is that the Civil War was fought mainly over states' rights or vague economic issues, not slavery. You will still hear people today insist slavery was just a side note. But if you look at what leaders in the South actually said, the picture is clear. In the mid-1800s, the United States was deeply divided. The southern states built their economy on slavery, using enslaved people to work huge cotton plantations that brought in enormous wealth. The northern states, on the other hand, had far fewer enslaved people and were moving toward a different kind of economy based on industry. As the country grew westward, the big question became, would new states allow slavery or not? This fight over expansion made the divide even sharper. The South feared that if slavery was banned in new territories, the balance of power in Congress would tip toward the North, and eventually slavery itself might be outlawed. To protect their way of life, Southern leaders chose to leave the Union and form their own country, the Confederacy. For years leading up to this, attempts were made to calm the storm. Deals like the Missouri Compromise and laws like the Fugitive Slave Act tried to hold the country together, but each one just caused more anger. By 1861, the disagreements had boiled over, and the first shots of the Civil War were fired. At its heart, the conflict was about slavery. After the South lost, many former Confederate leaders and writers did not want to admit that slavery was the cause. They began telling a different story, claiming the war had been about states' rights, as though it was a noble fight for freedom from government control. This version, later called the Lost Cause, made it easier for Southerners to cope with defeat and for North and South to come back together. But it ignored the truth. The reality is simple. The Civil War was fought because of slavery. Every other reason people give, states' rights, culture, or economics, always ties back to that single issue. And now we come to the last one, how America later wrote itself into world history as the lone superhero of World War II. The U.S. won World War II alone. We all know the story of how the United States charged in, crushed the Nazis, beat Japan, and saved the world almost single-handedly. It makes for a proud image and a perfect Hollywood blockbuster. But the truth is, World War II was a massive team effort, and no single country could have won it alone. The Soviet Union fought the largest battles of the war, taking on most of Hitler's army on the Eastern Front and losing millions of people in the process. Britain held off Germany during the Battle of Britain, fought in North Africa, and joined the D-Day invasion side by side with American forces. China had been fighting Japan for years before the U.S. even entered the war, suffering millions of deaths. Other nations, from Canada to Australia to occupied resistance groups across Europe, all played key parts. The United States did bring huge resources, soldiers, and industrial power once it entered the war in 1941. American factories built planes, tanks, and weapons at an astonishing rate. The U.S. military fought in both Europe and the Pacific, with campaigns like D-Day in France and island hopping against Japan. America's role was vital, but it was never a solo act. So why does the myth of America winning the war alone stick? Partly because of pride, and partly because of movies, TV, and textbooks that focus mostly on the U.S. story. During the Cold War, it also suited the United States to downplay the Soviet role. Over time, the simplified version became the one most Americans grew up hearing. The truth is that World War II was won by the Allies working together. The U.S. was a major player, but it was one of many. Remembering the full picture does not take away from America's achievements. It shows just how huge the struggle really was, and how much was sacrificed by nations across the world. If you enjoyed pulling back the curtain on these myths, make sure to subscribe, because there are plenty more hidden stories waiting to be told.